November 27, 1095, Clermont, France. A crowd of thousands stands in an open field. The air is cold. A pope climbs onto a wooden platform and begins to speak. What he said that day would send 200,000 men to war. It would bathe the streets of Jerusalem in blood. It would reshape the entire Christian world for centuries. Everyone knows what happened next. The crowd erupted. They screamed 4 words that echoed across Europe: God wills it. The First Crusade had begun. But here is what no one tells you. Not a single scribe wrote down what Urban II actually said. Not one word. The 5 versions we have today were all written years later, by men who were not there, and they contradict each other completely. In 2016, historian Georg Strack compared those chronicles against Urban's own letters. What he found was extraordinary. Jerusalem is barely mentioned. The war for the Holy Land may have been added to the story long after the crowd went home. So what did the Pope actually say that day? That is exactly what we uncover today here on The Silent Church. If you are new here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments, do you think the crusade was a divine mission or the most successful rewrite in history? Odo of Châtillon was not born into poverty, but he was born into a cage. His family held land near the small town of Châtillon-sur-Marne in the Champagne region of France. They were minor nobility, respectable enough to have a name, not powerful enough to matter. In the 11th century, that distinction meant everything. He was born around 1035. Life expectancy for a French male of his class was perhaps 45 years. He would live to 64, but he could not have known that then. What he knew was simpler and heavier. Second sons did not inherit. In the feudal world of 11th century France, the first son took the land, the title, the future. Every son after him took whatever was left, which was usually nothing. Odo was not the eldest, and so the church was not a calling, not yet. It was an arrangement, a practical solution to an inconvenient birth order. His family sent him to the Cathedral School of Reims around 1050. He was approximately 15 years old. Reims was not just any school. It was one of the great intellectual centers of northern France. The students there studied theology, rhetoric, philosophy, canon law. They were being shaped into instruments of the church, useful instruments, obedient ones. But something happened to Odo in Reims that no arrangement could explain. He became genuinely devout. There was a monk at Reims in those years. His name was Brother Anselm. He was perhaps 30 years old when Odo arrived. He taught rhetoric and scripture. Former students remembered him as a man who spoke quietly and expected you to lean in. He had a habit of asking questions he already knew the answer to, then waiting, watching what a student did with the silence. Anselm noticed Odo early, not because the boy was brilliant. Many students at Reims were brilliant. He noticed him because Odo was uncomfortable with easy answers. He pushed back. He asked why. He sat with contradictions longer than the other students were willing to. Anselm would later tell a colleague that Odo was the kind of student who made teaching worthwhile. He died in Reims sometime around 1070. He never saw what his student became. After Reims, Odo entered the Abbey of Cluny. This was not a small decision. Cluny was the most powerful monastery in Western Europe. Its influence stretched from Spain to Poland. Its abbot answered directly to Rome. To enter Cluny was to step into the engine room of the church's reform movement. The Cluniac reform had one central obsession: cleansing the church of corruption. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was rampant across Europe. Bishops were appointed by kings. Abbots were sold to the highest bidder. The sacred had been made commercial. And Cluny was the organized resistance to all of it. Odo absorbed this completely. He rose through the monastery with quiet consistency. He was not a man who demanded attention. He was a man who made himself indispensable. By 1078, Pope Gregory VII had noticed him. He appointed Odo Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, the port city just outside Rome. The appointment was a signal. Gregory was building a team, men he trusted, men who understood that reforming the church meant confronting the most powerful kings in Europe. That confrontation had a name: The investiture controversy. For decades, emperors had claimed the right to appoint bishops. The Church said that right belonged to Rome alone. Neither side was willing to yield. The result was a slow-motion war of excommunications, anti-popes and political betrayals that destabilized the entire continent. Odo entered this world not as a warrior, but as a diplomat. He served as papal legate in Germany in 1084. His task was nearly impossible. Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV had just installed a rival pope in Rome. Gregory VII had been driven from the city. The legitimate papacy was in exile. And Odo was sent to negotiate in the heart of enemy territory. He did not succeed in reversing Henry's position. No one could have. But he survived. He learned. He watched how power moved, how it bent, how it broke, and he stored every lesson. Gregory VII died in exile in 1085. His last recorded words were bitter. He said he had loved righteousness and hated iniquity, and therefore he died in exile. Odo stood at the edge of that legacy. He had watched a great reformer be destroyed by the world he tried to change. He had seen what happened to men who moved too fast, demanded too much, refused to compromise. The Church needed a different kind of man now. Not a warrior, not a martyr, something harder to define, and perhaps more dangerous. A man who understood power well enough to use it, without appearing to want it at all. Odo of Châtillon was 43 years old. He had spent nearly 3 decades learning the most important lesson the Church had to teach. Patience is not weakness. Patience is strategy. The papal election of 1088 did not happen in Rome. It could not. Rome belonged to someone else. Anti-Pope Clement III sat in the Lateran Palace, installed there by Emperor Henry IV. He had the buildings, he had the guards, he had the city. What he did not have was legitimacy. But in the 11th century, legitimacy without an army was just a philosophical argument. The cardinals loyal to reform met in Terracina, a small coastal town 60 miles south of Rome. Perhaps 12 cardinals present, not a full college, but enough. They needed someone specific, not a visionary, not a martyr, a survivor. The deliberations lasted 1 day. One name gathered consistent support, Odo of Châtillon, elected by acclamation. He took the name Urban II. He had no palace. No city, no army, just a title and a problem. For years, Urban lived as a guest, moving between courts of sympathetic rulers in southern Italy. The Normans of Campania received him. Roger I of Sicily offered protection. Urban accepted, but acceptance always has a price. To secure Norman support, he granted Roger extraordinary control over the Sicilian Church, the right to appoint bishops, to collect revenues, to judge ecclesiastical matters. These were precisely the privileges Urban would spend his entire pontificate denying every other ruler in Europe. It was not hypocrisy, it was arithmetic. Without Norman protection there was no papacy. Without a papacy there was no reform. He filed the contradiction away quietly. For later, there was a canon at the Lateran Basilica during these years named Father Guillaume, originally from Lyon, perhaps 40 years old. He kept records because someone had to. He catalogued correspondence, tracked which bishops had pledged support, watched which ones were still waiting to see which way the wind turned. Father Guillaume kept a personal journal. Fragments survived in a Burgundian monastic archive. In one entry around 1094, he described Urban arriving at the Lateran after months away. The Pope walked slowly through the building, touched the walls, said nothing for a long time. Father Guillaume wrote that Urban looked like a man visiting the grave of someone he had not finished grieving. What became of Father Guillaume after 1097, the records do not say. By 1095, Urban had survived long enough to think beyond survival. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent ambassadors to the Council of Piacenza in March of that year. The message was urgent. Turkish tribes had consumed most of formerly Byzantine Anatolia. Military help was needed. Urban listened carefully, said very little, sent the ambassadors home. Then he began planning the Council of Clermont for November. He spent months traveling through France, meeting bishops, meeting abbots, meeting local lords, building the audience before anyone knew what the performance would be. 7 years of exile had taught him one thing above all else. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is not an army. It is the right words, spoken to the right crowd. At exactly the right moment, November was coming. November 27th, 1095. The sun rose cold over Clermont. The city had been filling for days. Bishops and abbots had travelled from across France, from Burgundy, from Normandy, from the south. Some had walked for weeks. The roads into Clermont were thick with horses, carts, pilgrims, clergy. The smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies and candle wax hung over everything. The council itself had been running for 9 days. Mostly procedural, reforms debated, appointments confirmed, the usual machinery of church administration grinding forward. The bishops knew there would be a final public address. Urban had made that clear in his invitations, but no one knew exactly what he intended to say. That morning, Urban rose before dawn. Above, in the episcopal palace, the Pope dressed in silence. His chamberlain, a young deacon from Burgundy named Thomas, helped him with the vestments. Thomas was perhaps 22 years old. He had joined Urban's travelling court 2 years earlier in Lyon. He was quick with languages and quicker with numbers. Urban trusted him with correspondence. Thomas would later tell a fellow deacon that Urban ate almost nothing that morning. He sat for a long time at the small writing table in his room. He had papers in front of him. He read them slowly. Then he set them aside and did not look at them again. Thomas never knew what was written on those papers. He died of fever in Rome in 1098. 3 years before, he could have understood what that morning meant. Below, in the streets of Clermont, the mood was different. The public address had been announced for the open field beyond the cathedral. The cathedral itself could not hold the crowd that had gathered. Thousands of people pressed toward the wooden platform erected in the field. Farmers, merchants, minor knights. Women with children on their hips, men who had never attended a church council in their lives. A stonecutter named Bernard had walked 3 days from a village outside Issoire. He could not read. He had never heard a pope speak. He stood near the back of the crowd, behind a row of mounted knights, and could barely see the platform. He understood perhaps half of the Latin Urban would use. It did not matter. What Bernard remembered years later was not the words. It was the sound of the crowd when they responded. He said it felt like the ground moved. Bernard took the cross that same afternoon. He marched with the People's Crusade in 1096. He did not reach Jerusalem. What happened to him after that, the chronicles do not record. Urban climbed onto the platform sometime in the late morning. The crowd was already enormous. Estimates vary wildly. Some chroniclers wrote of tens of thousands. Others were more conservative. What is certain is that the field was full. The noise was constant, and the wind was blowing from the north. Urban raised his hand. The noise did not stop immediately. It took time. The silence came in waves, moving back through the crowd from front to back like a tide pulling out. And then he spoke. What did he look like in that moment? We have no physical description of Urban at Clermont, no portrait painted from life, no contemporary physical account. We know he was approximately 60 years old. We know he had been pope for 7 years. We know he had spent most of those years in exile, in transit, in negotiation. He was not a young man performing his first great act. He was an old man executing a plan he had been building for decades. Above, on the platform, Urban spoke for perhaps 30 minutes. His voice carried well in the cold air. The cardinals and bishops arranged around the platform listened with visible attention. Some took notes, or appeared to. Below, Bernard the stonecutter stood on his toes and watched a distant figure in white vestments move his arms slowly as he spoke. He caught fragments of words, heard the rhythm of the sentences rise and fall, understood enough to know that something was being asked of the crowd, something large, something permanent, something that could not be undone once given. Then the crowd responded. The sound came from everywhere at once. Thousands of voices producing the same syllables at the same moment. The chronicler Robert the Monk would later write that the crowd cried out as one, that the words rose spontaneously from every throat simultaneously. God wills it. Deus Vult. Whether those exact words were the ones shouted that day is a question we will return to, because the answer is more complicated than any chronicle admits. What is not complicated is the consequence. 200,000 people would eventually take the cross. Jerusalem would fall to Crusader forces in 1099. The streets would run with blood, and Urban II would die 14 days after that victory, never having received the news. But all of that was still in the future. On the morning of November 27, 1095, a crowd stood in a cold field in France and heard a pope speak words that no one thought to write down. That absence is where our story truly begins. What did Urban II actually say that day? We do not know, not because the records were destroyed, not because a fire consumed the archives, not because an emperor confiscated the documents. The records are simply absent because no one thought to create them. No official scribe was assigned to transcribe the speech, no papal secretary recorded the text. Urban himself left no written version behind. What we have instead are 5 accounts, written by 5 different men, at 5 different times in 5 different places, and they do not agree on anything essential. The 5 chroniclers are Fulcher of Chartres, Robert the Monk, Baldric of Dol, Guibert of Nogent, and an anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum. Fulcher was almost certainly present at Clermont. Robert the Monk may have been there. The others were not. All 5 wrote their versions between 1095 and 1106. Between 5 and 11 years after the speech was delivered. 5 years is a long time for memory to work unsupervised. Each version emphasizes different themes. Fulcher focuses on aiding the Eastern churches. He barely mentions Jerusalem. Robert the Monk places Jerusalem at the emotional center of the entire appeal. Guibert of Nogent frames the speech as a theological argument about holy violence. Baldric of Dol adds elaborate rhetoric that reads more like polished literature than eyewitness transcription. They cannot all be right. They may all be wrong. In 2016, historian Georg Strack published a detailed re-examination of Urban's own letters written immediately after Clermont. His finding was precise and uncomfortable. In Urban's personal correspondence from late 1095 and 1096, Jerusalem is mentioned sparingly. The stated goals are broader: aiding the Eastern churches, relieving Byzantine pressure, defending Christianity in general terms. The holy city that dominates every chronicle version of the speech appears in Urban's own letters as almost an afterthought. So where did Jerusalem come from? 3 interpretations exist, and none of them is comfortable. The first is the conservative reading. Urban mentioned Jerusalem, but briefly. The crowd latched onto it emotionally above everything else. The chroniclers, writing years later and shaped by the Crusade's outcome, naturally amplified what had resonated most. This is not falsification. It is the ordinary distortion of memory filtered through consequence. The speech became what it needed to have been. The second interpretation is more troubling. The Jerusalem framing was added deliberately. The First Crusade needed a sacred justification that transcended politics. Urban's actual goal, reuniting Eastern and Western churches and relieving Byzantine military pressure, was strategically useful but spiritually uninspiring. Jerusalem was the emotional engine that made recruitment possible. The chroniclers did not record the speech. They improved it. The third reading sits between the two. Urban himself may have used Jerusalem strategically in the spoken address while deliberately omitting it from written correspondence. Letters travel. Letters are read by enemies. A pope negotiating simultaneously with Byzantine emperors, Norman lords, and hostile cardinals could not afford to commit to the same message in writing that he delivered to an emotional crowd in an open field. The speech and the letters were never meant to be compared. No one anticipated that comparison would still be happening 900 years later. Here is what the documentary record confirms, without interpretation. No original transcription exists. All 5 versions were written after the fact. They contradict each other on central points, and Urban's own letters do not support the Jerusalem-centered narrative that every chronicle version insists upon. Everything else is inference. The most consequential speech in medieval history exists today as 5 competing reconstructions, none authoritative, none verifiable, all shaped by the world the speech itself created. The words that launched the Crusades were never written down. And the words that were written down suggest a different speech entirely. If the speech was distorted, who benefited? That question has no clean answer, but it has a trail. Urban II died on July 29, 1099. 14 days after Crusader forces took Jerusalem, he never received the news. He died in Rome, finally restored to the city denied to him for most of his pontificate. The anti-pope Clermont III had been expelled 2 years earlier. The reform movement had survived. The papacy had survived. Urban had won, on almost every front, and then he was gone. Before anyone could ask him what he had actually intended. The chroniclers who wrote the versions of his speech were not neutral observers. Robert the Monk wrote his account around 1106. By that point, the First Crusade had succeeded. Jerusalem had fallen. The Crusader states were being established. Writing a version of Urban's speech that emphasized Jerusalem was not distortion in his mind. It was clarification. History had revealed what the speech must have meant. Guibert of Nogent went further. He acknowledged in his own text that he was reconstructing Urban's words from memory and report. He was not claiming to transcribe, he was claiming to interpret, to give the speech the theological coherence it deserved. This is the moment where history and narrative diverge. Fulcher of Chartres changes everything. He was almost certainly present at Clermont. He wrote his version closest to the event, and his account is the most restrained, the least dramatic, the least Jerusalem-centered. For centuries, historians considered Fulcher the least useful source, too dry, too politically specific, lacking rhetorical power. Georg Strack's 2016 analysis inverted that judgment entirely. Fulcher's restraint is precisely what makes him most credible. He wrote before Jerusalem fell, before the crusade succeeded, before there was any narrative pressure to make the speech sound like prophecy fulfilled. What he recorded was messier, less inspiring, and far more consistent with Urban's own letters. 3 interpretations shape how historians read this today. The first is simple. No one invented anything deliberately. Collective memory selected what resonated most. The rest faded. This is how oral transmission always works, not conspiracy. Human nature. The second interpretation is harder to dismiss. The chroniclers writing after 1099 had institutional reasons. The Crusader states needed legitimacy. The papacy needed the crusade to appear visionary rather than reactive. A speech about aiding Byzantium serves no one in 1106. A speech about liberating the holy city of Christ serves everyone. The third reading focuses on Urban himself. Perhaps he varied his message deliberately. Jerusalem prominent in some speeches, absent in others depending on the crowd. The Clermont address was one moment in a months-long campaign. The chroniclers may each have captured a different version of the same man. In that case, no single version is false, and no single version is complete. What died with Urban on July 29, 1099, was not just a pope. It was the only person who knew what he had actually meant to set in motion. His successor, Pope Paschal II, inherited a crusade already underway, a Jerusalem already taken, a narrative already hardening into the shape it would hold for 9 centuries. The speech had become the story, and the story had become the truth. 3 words changed the world. God wills it. Or did they? The phrase Deus Vult became the battle cry of the First Crusade. Crusaders sewed it onto their tunics, shouted it before combat, carved it into stone. For 9 centuries it has been inseparable from the image of Urban at Clermont, the crowd erupting, the spontaneous cry rising from thousands of throats simultaneously. Robert the Monk wrote it that way. The crowd responded as one. The words came from everywhere at once, as if God himself had placed them there. It is a powerful image. It may also be a constructed one. The problem is simple. No other chronicle confirms the Deus Vult moment in the same way. Fulcher of Chartres, the most credible eyewitness, does not record the crowd crying out those specific words. Baldric of Dole describes a crowd response, but with different phrasing. Guibert of Nogent focuses on the emotional reaction without committing to specific words. Only Robert the Monk gives us Deus Vult as a spontaneous collective cry, and Robert the Monk was writing 11 years after the fact. Historians have debated this for decades. The question is not minor. If Deus Vult was spontaneous, it suggests divine confirmation. A crowd moved by the Holy Spirit to speak with one voice. This is the version the medieval church preferred. It made the crusade sacred rather than political. If Deus Vult was constructed afterward, it suggests something different entirely. A battle cry invented for recruitment, a slogan engineered to make holy war feel inevitable, chosen and polished and repeated until it felt like memory. Slogans do not require truth. They require repetition. Urban's own letters offer no help here. He never references the crowd's response at Clermont in his surviving correspondence. He never quotes Deus Vult. He never describes the emotional atmosphere of that November afternoon. His letters after Clermont are focused and practical: logistics, recruitment targets, departure dates. The spiritual temperature of the crowd is simply absent. A man who had just witnessed a spontaneous outpouring of divine confirmation might have mentioned it. He did not. 3 readings present themselves. The first accepts Robert the Monk at face value. The crowd did cry out. The words were real. Fulcher simply chose not to record them. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The second reading is more skeptical. Deus Vult emerged gradually as the Crusade's defining slogan and was retroactively inserted into the Clermont moment. Robert the Monk, writing in a world where the phrase was already everywhere, placed it at the origin point. Where else would it have come from? The third reading is the most unsettling. Urban may have introduced the phrase himself, not as a spontaneous crowd response but as a prepared rhetorical device, a call and response built into the speech deliberately. The crowd did not invent the words, they were given them. And the distinction between inspiration and instruction was allowed to blur over time. Each reading is possible, none is provable. What Georg Strack's 2016 research clarified was not what Urban said. It clarified how completely the world reshaped his words to fit what came after. The crusade succeeded, Jerusalem fell, the slogan spread across Europe, and the speech at Clermont was slowly reconstructed around the outcome it had produced. This is not unique to the medieval church. It is not unique to religion. Every origin story gets edited by its consequences. Every founding moment gets remembered as the story that the result required. Urban II stood on a platform in a cold field in France and said something. The crowd responded somehow. And then 9 centuries of consequence poured through that gap between what happened and what was written down. The gap is still there. It has never been closed. November 27th, 1095. The field outside Clermont is empty now. The crowd has gone home. The wooden platform still stands. The cold wind moves through the space where thousands of people stood an hour ago. A few scraps of cloth, a lost sandal, the ash of a small fire someone lit to stay warm. Thomas, the young deacon from Burgundy, walks back toward the episcopal palace alone. He is 22 years old. He does not yet understand what he witnessed. He knows only that the crowd was enormous, that the Pope spoke for a long time, that the response was unlike anything he had ever heard. He will spend the rest of his short life in Urban's service. He will die of fever in Rome in 1098. He will never know that the morning he helped a pope dress in silence became one of the most consequential moments in human history. He carried that morning inside him without knowing its weight. We all do that, more often than we realize. Urban returned to Rome in the years that followed. The anti-pope was expelled. The city was his at last. He had waited nearly 11 years for that moment, 11 years of exile, negotiation, compromise, patience. He did not celebrate publicly. There is no record of any ceremony marking his return to full possession of the city. He simply resumed governing, as if the exile had been an interruption rather than a defining experience. But it had defined him completely. The man who stood at Clermont was not the cardinal who had been elected in Terracina in 1088. 11 years of living without certainty had produced something specific, a capacity to act decisively while appearing calm, to build enormous consequences from quiet preparations. He had learned that the most powerful forces in the world are the ones that feel inevitable. The crusade felt inevitable. That was not an accident. Bernard the Stonecutter never reached Jerusalem. He marched with the People's Crusade in 1096. The expedition was catastrophic, poorly organized, poorly supplied, massacred by Turkish forces in Anatolia before reaching the Holy Land. Of the tens of thousands who marched, very few survived. Bernard stood in that field in Clermont and heard something that moved him so completely, he walked away from his life. His tools, his village, his family, everything he had built with his hands. He heard a speech no one recorded. He responded to words no one can verify. He gave everything for a cause whose founding moment exists today only as 5 contradictory reconstructions. He was not deceived. He was inspired. Whether those two things are different is a question that has no comfortable answer. Urban II died on July 29, 1099. He was approximately 64 years old. He had been pope for 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days. He died in Rome, in the house of a nobleman named Pietro Pierleoni, who had been one of his most loyal supporters during the years of exile. The cause of death is not recorded precisely. He had been ill for some time. The summer heat in Rome was brutal that year. 14 days before his death, Crusader forces had taken Jerusalem. The streets had run with blood. The holy city was in Christian hands for the first time in centuries. Urban never knew. The news was traveling toward Rome when he died. Somewhere on the road between Jerusalem and Italy, a messenger carried the outcome of everything Urban had set in motion. And Urban slipped away before that messenger arrived. He died not knowing if it had worked. That detail feels important. A man who had spent his entire pontificate building toward a single consequence did not live to receive it. History gave him the cause, but not the confirmation. There is something almost deliberate about that silence. Pope Paschal II was elected 5 days after Urban's death. He inherited a transformed world. The Crusader states were being established. The papacy's authority had been dramatically reinforced. The reform movement Urban had dedicated his life to was still unfinished but alive. Pascal also inherited the silence around Clermont, the absence of any official record, the 5 competing versions already circulating. The gap that would never be filled. He did not attempt to fill it. No official version was ever commissioned. No papal decree established what Urban had said. The speech remained what it had always been, a memory shaped by consequence, a founding moment with no fixed text. 900 years later, we are still standing in that gap. Georg Strack's 2016 research did not close it. It made it wider, more honest, more uncomfortable. We know Urban wrote letters that barely mentioned Jerusalem. We know the chroniclers wrote speeches that placed Jerusalem at the center of everything. We know those two facts cannot be fully reconciled. What we do not know is which version of Urban II was real. The diplomatic correspondent who spoke carefully about Eastern churches and Byzantine pressure, or the visionary pope who told a crowd that God himself was calling them to reclaim the holy city. Perhaps both were real. Perhaps neither was complete. Perhaps that is exactly what he intended. The wooden platform stood empty in the cold field outside Clermont as the last light faded on November 27, 1095. No one was writing anything down, and the words that were never recorded became the most repeated words in medieval history. Here on the silent church, that silence is not the end of the story. It is always where the story begins.